Welcome to day 19 of our scripture reading and encouragement. Today we're going to cover Genesis 49 and 50. As we finish up Genesis, we're going to move over into Exodus and cover chapter 1. Then we're going to go to the New Testament and begin Matthew 16, just covering the first 4 verses. So as we pick up in Genesis, Jacob knows he's near death. He brings in each of his sons, and the goal is to bless them. But it's interesting, he starts out by calling out Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. He's pretty truthful and brutal with his calling them out about what their lives have been, and he actually pulls the blessing off of Reuben, who would have been his firstborn and normally gotten the blessing. He pulls that off of him and ultimately gives it to Joseph. But it says that these become the 12 tribes of Israel. So as we go throughout the Old Testament, we're going to hear about the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is where it's setting that up, that each of these sons and their families will represent a clan or a tribe that will define the Israelite nation as they go into the future. In Genesis 49, verse 10, it says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor." This is a prophecy of Jesus right here in verse 10. And we talked a couple of days ago about how Jesus came out of the line of Judah. He becomes the Lion of Judah, but he comes out of the line of Judah. And this is given that prophecy right here. We're already told, the descendants and the lineage. We went through that, how it covers it in Genesis, and it refers to it in Matthew. But this is the actual prophecy where they're being told Jesus is going to come out of the line of Judah. So as Jacob is dying, he asks Joseph, please take me back to my, father's land where he's buried, where my grandfather Abraham is buried. And Joseph, agrees to do that and promises he will. But as soon as Jacob dies, what happens with the brothers? Oh no, Dad's dead. Dad's been protecting us. Joseph's surely going to do away with us and destroy us. So they become very fearful that Joseph's going to kill them. They think it's going to be their payback for the time that they did evil things to him many years before. But when Joseph hears that they're thinking this, it says that he wept. If you notice, anytime that Joseph sees them scared or hurting or worried, he shows great compassion for them. And he says something that I think should be an encouragement to all of us. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good." See, Joseph understood God's plan. Joseph understood that he had to endure all those hardships to get to the place to save many people. And he tells them that. And I think that should be an encouragement for us. I've said this many times before, but you will find what you're looking for. If you're only looking for bad in a situation or negative, you will find it. But if you're able to stop and look for good in a bad situation, you'll find it as well. So the encouragement for you is to have the mind of Joseph, to endure. We've talked about this before, but to endure the hardships that you don't understand, and to be able to see that there were things that Satan intended for harm, but God saw you through it because he intended it all for good. So I want you to be encouraged with that today. Genesis ends in chapter 50 with Joseph passing away. And he asks his brothers, "Make a promise that you'll send me back, just like my father. You'll send my bones back to the land where my father and grandfather are buried." So as we end up Genesis starts with a story of creation, which is this incredible story. Then immediately the fall, where Satan comes in and tempts them. And then we begin to move into the promise of Abraham and setting up this line of descendants and how they got from their land where they lived to Egypt, and how God used that to save them. And then we transition to Exodus, and we see quite a different story. We see a story of God's chosen people being put into oppression, into slavery. And it tells us at the beginning of Exodus that Joseph, we know he's already died in Genesis, but it says his brothers die off. That entire generation dies off. But before that generation dies off, they have multiplied to become a pretty great nation themselves. They become powerful because there's so many of them, because God has blessed them. And then here's a key thing. A new Pharaoh comes in, a new king of Egypt, new Pharaoh comes in. And it says this Pharaoh didn't know what Joseph had done. So this Pharaoh didn't know how Joseph and his people had been the saving grace of Egypt during the famine. And this Pharaoh, only worried about power, becomes very fearful of the numbers, the sheer numbers of the Israelites. He is fearful that they're going to join up with his enemies and help defeat them. So he turns them into slaves. And he says, we're going to wear them down with brutal labor. Here's something funny. The more he oppressed them, the more they multiplied. I think there's some encouragement here too, because it seems to be throughout time and even now, when God's people, when us as Christians, when we are oppressed, that is the time we thrive. So if you're feeling oppressed right now, I know there's a lot of oppression in the world, a lot of oppression in our communities. Rejoice in that, because this is the time that we thrive as God's people. Back in the time of Exodus, as well as the time now, us as believers, this is the time that we thrive. The more we're oppressed, the more we should thrive. And that's what we see here. But Pharaoh said, okay, now we're going to start killing off the boys. We got to get rid of these Hebrew boys. They cannot keep multiplying. And that's kind of where the story ends for today in Exodus 1. We're going to pick up tomorrow right into the story of Moses being born and some people standing up to Pharaoh to hide Moses. Most of us know this story, but we're going to dig into that tomorrow, starting in Exodus 2. As we flip over really quickly to Matthew 16, we only cover 4 verses in Matthew 16 this morning. But there's a famous thing that we often say. You ever heard the term, red sky at night, sailor's delight? Red sky in the morn, sailors be warned? Jesus says it right here in Matthew 16. The Pharisees come and they're demanding a miraculous sign from heaven. They're wanting God to show them that Jesus is the Messiah, if he's truly the Messiah in their terms. And Jesus is saying, you've got these sayings. Red sky at night means fair weather tomorrow. Red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to see that I'm the Messiah. And he calls them an evil, adulterous generation for demanding a miraculous sign. And then he tells them, I'm going to give you the sign of Jonah, which Jonah went into the belly of the whale for 3 days, then came out alive. Jesus is going to go into the belly of the earth for 3 days and come out alive. But I think the key thing is he's saying we need to be careful. We need to be able to see what the evidence of what God's done or what Jesus has done in our lives. We shouldn't be asking God for a miraculous sign. And sometimes we do that as believers. Sometimes we say, God, just show me a miracle. If you really are who you say you are, show me a miracle. And I think Jesus is warning us here that we shouldn't have that attitude. We should be able to see the other signs that were already given, the way he's moved in our lives, and have our faith out of that, not out of seeing this miraculous sign. I hope that you are encouraged today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.